The man stood before the iron gate, his trembling hands clutching a yellowed envelope. On the other side, through the golden bars, he could see the mansion where he had grown up, now transformed into a luxury office building. The cold morning wind carried the smell of impending rain, and he adjusted his worn coat, taking a deep breath. He didn't know that, at that very moment, someone was watching him from behind the silk curtains. He didn't know that this meeting would change two lives forever. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of approaching footsteps from inside the house. Before we dive into this story, please leave a comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're watching from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. It was a Tuesday in July when Robert Smith woke up at 5 in the morning, as he had for 40 years. Not because he wanted to. At 72, his body ached in ways he could no longer explain, but because the habit had roots deeper than his will. He rose slowly from the narrow bed, feeling the cold of the cement floor under his bare feet. Marina was still asleep beside him, her breathing heavy, a sign she had spent another sleepless night worrying about bills that wouldn't add up. The house they had lived in for 3 decades was small but clean. Robert always said that poverty was no excuse for slovenliness. The peeling walls were brought to life by the colorful dish towels Marina embroidered in her spare time, and the smell of coffee always heralded the start of another day of struggle. He walked to the kitchen, lit the old stove, and put the kettle on to heat. The ritual was always the same. Black coffee, 2 slices of bread when there was butter, and the newspaper the neighbor left after reading it. But that morning, something was different. Robert noticed it when he opened the door to get the paper. A black car was parked on the corner, an expensive model that didn't belong in the neighborhood. The driver, a young man in a suit, seemed to be waiting for something. Robert felt a shiver run down his spine. It wasn't paranoia, it was experience. 40 years working as a doorman had taught him to read signs, to notice when something was out of place. He closed the door slowly and went back to the kitchen. Marina was already awake, sitting at the small formica table, her hands wrapped around a cup as if seeking warmth. "There's a strange car on the street," Robert said in a low voice. Marina looked up. She was still a beautiful woman, despite her gray hair and the wrinkles that told stories of worry. Her blue eyes, once as clear as the sky, now carried the weariness of someone who had cried too much. "Do you think it's—" she began but didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what it was about. In recent weeks, Robert had lost his job at the building where he worked. The new, impatient building manager said he needed someone more agile for the position. Translation, someone younger. At 72, Robert discovered that his experience was worth less than the energy of a 20-year-old. Their savings lasted 2 weeks. The rent was late, the electricity bill too. Marina had tried to sell her embroideries at the local market, but competition was fierce and the money was little. They talked about asking for help, but pride, that old companion that had been with them for decades, always spoke louder until the letter arrived. Robert opened the envelope the mailman had delivered the previous Friday. It was an eviction notice, 30 days to leave the house where they had built their most precious memories. The paper trembled in his hands as he read the legal terms, which translated meant only one thing: they had nowhere to go. "Robert," Marina held her husband's hand. "Maybe it's time." He knew what she was talking about. For 30 years, they had avoided that conversation. For 30 years, pride and dignity had been more important than anything else. But now, with the eviction notice on the table and their stomachs growling, maybe it really was time. Time to find their son. Robert closed his eyes and went back in time. Edward Smith was born on a rainy September afternoon, 52 years ago. He was a fussy baby but smart. He learned to walk early, to talk even earlier. In school, he was always at the top of his class. Robert remembered the pride he felt when the teachers called him in to talk about the prodigy they wanted to skip a grade. Edward dreamed big. He said that one day he would be important, that he would have money to buy a big house for his parents, that they would never be in need again. Robert believed him. So did Marina. They worked double shifts to pay for their son's education, saving every penny so he could devote himself entirely to his books. At 18, Edward won a scholarship to study business at a private university. He was the first person in the family to set foot in a college. Robert remembered graduation day, he and Marina in the front row. She in the blue dress she had bought especially for the occasion. He in a borrowed suit, but with his chest puffed out with pride. After graduation, Edward got a job at a large company. In the beginning, he still visited his parents on weekends, brought gifts, told them about his new job. But gradually, the visits became rarer. The calls more spaced out. The gifts stopped coming. Robert tried to understand. His son was building his own life. It was natural for him to pull away. But Marina suffered. She prepared Edward's favorite lunch every Sunday, even knowing he wouldn't come. She would leave his plate on the table, as if hope could materialize him. The rupture happened over a silly argument, the kind that starts small and grows until it's bigger than the feelings involved. Edward had been promoted again and was earning well. Robert suggested that he help with the household expenses, not as an obligation, but as a way of repaying the investment they had made in his education. Edward exploded. He said he was tired of hearing about sacrifices, that he hadn't asked to be born, that his parents had made their choices. He said that now he had his own life, his own plans, and that he wouldn't carry the weight of others' limitations. The words came out like stones, each one hitting Robert in the chest. But the sentence that hurt the most was the last one. You gave me the life you could. Now I'm going to live the life I deserve. That was almost 30 years ago. 30 years of silence. 30 years of wounded pride on both sides. 30 years of Marina crying silently on her son's birthdays. Of Robert pretending not to care when he saw Edward on television. Because yes, he had become important. Very important. Edward Smith was now the CEO of one of the largest construction companies in the country. His face appeared in business magazines, on the financial pages of newspapers. He had a beach house, a condo in Paris, the latest model car. He had fulfilled all the dreams he had promised in his youth. All but one. He never came home again. Robert opened his eyes and looked at Marina. She had tears in her eyes, but also a determination he hadn't seen in a long time. I know where he works, she said. I saw it in the paper yesterday. His company inaugurated a new building on Park Avenue. Marina, you know how he treated us last time. I know. But I also know he's still our son, Robert sighed. Outside, the black car was still parked at the corner. The driver was now talking on the phone, gesticulating. It was probably someone from the bank or from the law firm handling the eviction process. The walls were closing in. If we go there, Robert said, it won't be to ask for money. It will be to say that we are a family, and that family doesn't abandon family. Marina smiled for the first time in weeks. It will be to remind him where he came from. They spent the rest of the morning getting ready. Marina took from the closet the only formal outfit she still owned, a navy blue suit she had worn to a neighbor's wedding 5 years earlier. It was a bit tight, but it still fit. Robert put on the suit pants he wore to church, a white shirt that Marina had ironed with special care, and the blazer he had received as a Christmas gift a decade ago. At 2 in the afternoon, they were at their doorstep, ready to face the son who had become a stranger. Are you sure? Robert asked. Marina squeezed his hand tightly. I'm sure that we can't die without trying. They walked to the bus stop, Robert carrying the yellowed envelope containing all of Edward's childhood photos, and Marina holding the purse where she had kept the only memento left from her son's early years, a drawing he had made in school at age 7, showing a happy family in front of a house with a garden. The bus to downtown took 40 minutes to arrive. During the ride, they barely spoke. Robert looked out the window, watching the city transform. The simple houses giving way to tall buildings, the outskirts yielding to progress. Marina held the strap of her purse tightly. mentally rehearsing the words she would say to her son. When they got off on Park Avenue, they felt small before the skyscrapers that rose like giants of glass and concrete. The movement was intense, people in a hurry, cars honking, the frantic rhythm of a city that never stops. Robert remembered how Edward used to talk about this place when he was young, as if it were the center of the universe. Maybe it really was, at least for those with money. They asked a police officer where the Smith & Associates construction company building was. The man pointed to a 40-story all-glass building that reflected the blue afternoon sky. It was impossible not to be impressed. "It's there," Marina said, her voice barely audible. Robert looked up, trying to see the top of the building. Somewhere inside was the son they had raised, loved, and educated. The son who was now a stranger. They walked to the entrance. The lobby was huge, all marble, with a reception desk that looked like it belonged in a palace. Robert had never seen so much luxury in one place. The receptionist, a young blonde woman with a professional smile, greeted them courteously, but Robert noticed the look she gave their clothes. "How can I help you?" she asked. "We want to speak with Edward Smith," Marina said, her voice firm. "Mr. Smith is in a meeting. Do you have an appointment?" Robert and Marina looked at each other. "An appointment to speak with their own son. We're his parents," Robert said. The receptionist's expression changed. For a moment, the professional mask fell, and Robert saw genuine surprise in her eyes. She picked up the phone, dialed a number, and spoke in a low voice. After a few minutes, she hung up. Mr. Smith's secretary said he is in a very important meeting that cannot be interrupted. Would you like to leave a message? Robert felt anger rise in his chest. A meeting too important to see his own parents. He opened his mouth to respond, but Marina held his arm. "We'll wait," she said, "as long as it takes." And so, Robert and Marina Smith sat in the marble lobby of their son's company, determined to wait. They didn't know that this wait would not only change their lives, but also awaken echoes that had long slept in the heart of a man who had forgotten where he came from. Upstairs, on the 40th floor, Edward Smith was ending a meeting about a $2 billion project, with no idea that his life was about to be turned upside down by two people waiting patiently on the ground floor, carrying 30 years of longing and a yellowed envelope full of memories. Edward Smith adjusted his Italian tie and looked out the panoramic window of his office. Below, New York City stretched out like a sea of concrete and endless possibilities. At 52, he had achieved everything he had dreamed of in his youth and much more. The mirror on the wall reflected an elegant man, with perfectly styled gray hair and a tailored suit that cost more than many people earned in a year. But that afternoon, something was bothering him. Maybe it was the meeting he had just finished, about a housing project that would displace low-income families to build a shopping mall. The numbers were impressive, the profit guaranteed, but throughout the presentation, Edward couldn't stop thinking about the faces of the people whose lives would be changed by the stroke of his pen. Or maybe it was the date. It was exactly 30 years to the day since he had last spoken to his parents. Edward never admitted it, but he kept the date in his memory like a scar that insisted on aching on rainy days. July 15th, 1994, a Tuesday just like this one. He had gone to his parents' house for dinner to tell them about his new promotion. Robert had suggested he help with the bills. Edward had exploded. The words he said that day still echoed in his mind in moments of silence. "You gave me the life you could. Now I'm going to live the life I deserve." Why had he been so cruel? Why had he hurt the two people who loved him most in the world? His secretary knocked on the door, interrupting his thoughts. "Mr. Smith, there are two people at reception who claim to be your parents." Edward felt the world stop. The air conditioning kept running, the phone on the desk next to him kept ringing, the traffic below kept moving, but for him, everything froze. "My parents?" he repeated, as if the word were foreign in his mouth. "Yes, sir. The receptionist said they've been waiting for 2 hours. 2 hours. Robert and Marina had waited 2 hours just for the chance to see him. Edward closed his eyes and tried to imagine what they looked like now. The last image he had of them in his memory was of his father at 42, his hair still dark, his hands strong from hard work. His mother was a woman with an easy smile, who hummed while she cooked and always found a way to make a little seem like a lot. "Sir?" the secretary insisted. Edward opened his eyes. Outside the window, a cloud passed in front of the sun, momentarily darkening the office. It was as if the sky was reflecting what was happening in his heart. Tell them I'm in an important meeting. But, sir, your schedule is free until 6. Edward looked at his secretary, an efficient 40-year-old woman who had worked for him for a decade. She knew his routine better than he did. She knew he was lying. "Just say I'm busy," he repeated, his voice firmer. The secretary hesitated but nodded and left the room. Edward let himself fall into the expensive leather armchair. The office was a temple of success. Framed diplomas on the wall, Businessman of the Year trophies, a privileged view of the city. But at that moment, it all felt hollow. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. "Dr. Henry, it's Edward. I need to cancel our appointment for tomorrow." "No, it's not a company emergency. It's personal." Dr. Henry had been his therapist for 5 years. Edward had started therapy after a panic attack during an important presentation. The doctor discovered that the root of his problems lay in his relationship with his family, in the ghosts of the past that Edward insisted on denying. 20 minutes later, Edward was in Dr. Henry's office. A 60-year-old man with a grey beard and kind eyes that always managed to see beyond the words. "They showed up," Edward said without preamble. "My parents. They're at the company." Dr. Henry showed no surprise. In 5 years of sessions, they had talked a lot about Robert and Marina. "How do you feel?" Edward laughed, but it was a bitter laugh. "I should be asking how they are. If they're okay, if they need anything. But all I can think about is how much I hurt them and how much I'm afraid they'll hurt me too." "Afraid of what, specifically?" Edward was silent for a few minutes. Outside, he could hear the sound of traffic, people living their normal lives while his was being turned upside down. "Afraid that they're not doing well. Afraid that they've been struggling while I lived in luxury. Afraid that it's too late to fix what I broke. And what if it's not too late? Doctor, I've built an empire. I have employees, responsibilities, a reputation to uphold. I can't what? Be a son?" The words hit Edward like a punch to the gut. Be a son. When was the last time he had allowed himself to feel that? When was the last time he had thought of Robert and Marina as a father and mother, and not as a closed chapter of his life? While Edward was in his therapist's office trying to sort out his feelings, Robert and Marina were still waiting in the company lobby. The 2 hours had turned into 3, then 4. The sun was already setting when the receptionist approached them again. "Look, you are very kind people, but I don't think Mr. Smith will be able to see you today. How about you come back another day?" Robert was about to agree. His legs ached and Marina looked exhausted. But that's when she stood up and did something that surprised everyone, including herself. Marina took from her purse the drawing Edward had made in school at age 7. It was a piece of paper, yellowed with time, with crayon scribbles showing a happy family in front of a house with a garden. Underneath, in a child's crooked handwriting, it said, "My beautiful family. I love my mommy and daddy. Please," Marina said, handing the drawing to the receptionist. "Take this to him. Tell him we're not here to ask for anything. We're here to give." The young woman looked at the drawing, then at the elderly couple who had been waiting for hours, and something in her heart moved. She had small children. She knew the value of a drawing made with love. "I'll take it to him," she promised. 15 minutes later, Edward's secretary knocked on his door again. He had returned from the therapist's office more confused than when he left. "Mr. Smith, the receptionist sent this up for you." Edward looked at the paper in his secretary's hands and felt his legs weaken. It was his school drawing, the one he had made for Mother's Day when he was 7. He remembered the day he brought it home perfectly, proud of his work. Robert had lifted him in his arms and said it was the most beautiful drawing in the world. Marina had stuck it on the refrigerator and said she would never take it down, and they had kept it. For all these years, through all the changes, they had kept a drawing made by a child who dreamed of a happy family. Edward held the paper carefully, as if it were a sacred relic. His hands trembled when he saw his own childish handwriting. "I love my mommy and daddy." In that moment, he realized a terrible and liberating truth at the same time. He still loved them. Despite everything, despite the years, the hurt, the wounded pride, he still loved Robert and Marina. And if they had kept that drawing for 30 years, maybe they still loved him too. Edward stood up from his chair, straightened his tie, and walked to the elevator. Each floor he descended felt like a journey back in time. 40, 35, 30. The memories came back in flashes. Robert teaching him to ride a bike, Marina singing him to sleep, the three of them watching television together on the old living room sofa. When the elevator doors opened on the ground floor, Edward saw 2 elderly people sitting on the lobby sofa. The man was short, with completely white hair, his shoulders stooped by the weight of the years. The woman beside him held a purse on her lap, her hair in a simple bun, her clothes humble but clean. It was them. It was Robert and Marina, his parents. For a moment, Edward couldn't move. They seemed so small, so fragile. When he remembered them, he still saw them as the giants of his childhood. The strong father who solved all problems, the caring mother who healed all wounds. Now he saw 2 elderly people whom life had bent, but who were still there waiting for him. Marina was the first to see him. Her eyes widened, and she touched Robert's arm. When he turned and saw his son, Edward noticed something that made him want to cry. Pride. Even after everything, there was still pride in his father's eyes. Robert stood up slowly, helping Marina to do the same. They stood there for a few seconds, 10 feet apart, as if there were a chasm between them. It was Edward who took the first step. "Dad," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Mom." "Son," Robert replied, and in that simple word were 30 years of longing. Marina began to cry, but they were tears of relief, of happiness, of a love that had survived all the suffering. Edward looked around and realized that several people in the lobby were watching the scene. Employees, visitors, security guards, everyone had stopped what they were doing to watch the reunion. "Let's go upstairs," Edward said. "We have a lot to talk about." And so after 30 years of silence, Robert and Marina Smith entered the elevator with their son, ascending together towards the New York sky, carrying with them a child's drawing and the hope that it is never too late to mend a broken heart. But they didn't know that the conversation awaiting them would reveal secrets that would change everything they thought they knew about each other. They didn't know that sometimes finding your family can be harder than losing it. The elevator ascended in silence, 40 floors that felt like an eternity. Robert watched the numbers change on the panel, 15, 20, 25, each one marking a distance that was closing between the past and the present. Marina clutched her purse strap tightly, her eyes fixed on the son, who was now an important man, but who to her was still the little boy who ran through the house shouting, "Mom, look what I did!" Edward breathed slowly, trying to control the anxiety rising in his chest. In the reflection of the mirrored elevator doors, he saw 3 people who had once been a family. Now they were almost strangers, united only by blood ties and memories that time had blurred like old photographs. When the doors opened on the 40th floor, Edward led his parents down the elegant corridor to his office. The walls were paneled with oak, the marble floor reflecting the lights from the chandelier. Every detail screamed success, power, achievement. Robert looked at everything with wide eyes. His son had come so far, further than he had ever dreamed. Marina noticed the photographs on the wall. Edward with politicians, businessmen, celebrities she only knew from television. But there wasn't a single family photo. "Please have a seat," Edward said, indicating the armchairs in front of his desk. Robert and Marina settled in carefully, as if they were afraid of breaking something. The silence stretched for a few minutes. 30 years of distance are not easily broken with words. It was Marina who spoke first. "Are you okay, son? Are you happy?" The question was simple, but it hit Edward like a well-aimed arrow. When was the last time someone had asked if he was happy? Everyone always wanted to know about business, profits, expansion. No one cared about his well-being. Edward swallowed hard. "I have everything I ever wanted." "That's not what I asked," Marina said, with the firm gentleness that only mothers possess. Edward looked at her, really looked. He now saw the wrinkles around her eyes, the thinner skin of her hands, the grey hair that had once been brown like his. But he also saw the same kindness as always, the same unconditional love he had rejected years ago. "I don't know if I'm happy," he finally admitted. "I have success, I have money, I have recognition, but happiness, it's different, isn't it?" Robert shifted in his chair. "Happiness is what you feel when you come home and someone is waiting for you. It's knowing that you matter to someone not for what you have, but for who you are. And do you have that, son?" Marina asked. Edward lowered his eyes. His home was an empty mansion. He had been married twice, but the marriages hadn't lasted. The women liked the money, the status, the luxurious life he could offer. When they discovered that behind the success was an empty man, they left in search of other conquests. "No," he answered honestly. "I don't." Marina got up from her armchair and did something that surprised everyone. She walked around the gigantic desk and hugged her son. Edward smelled the scent he had forgotten, but was still engraved in his memory. The cheap perfume mixed with the smell of home, of affection, of a mother. "Oh, my son," Marina whispered. "How you've grown, how important you've become." Edward closed his eyes, and for a moment he was a child again. For a moment he forgot about the meetings, the contracts, the responsibilities. He was just a son in his mother's arms, but reality soon returned. "Why did you come?" Edward asked, gently pulling away from the hug. "After all these years, why now?" Robert and Marina looked at each other. It was the question they expected, but feared answering. Robert began, but his voice failed him. "We're in trouble, son," Marina said, deciding honesty was the best path. "I lost my job. We're having trouble paying the rent. We're going to be evicted." Edward felt a pang in his chest. It was exactly what he had feared. They were here for money. All the emotion of the reunion, all the warmth of the hug. Was it just a strategy to soften his heart? "How much do you need?" he asked, his voice cold again. Robert stood up from the armchair, his face red with indignation. "We didn't come here to ask for money." "No?" Edward raised an eyebrow. "Then why did you come?" "We came because we are a family," Robert said, his voice firm despite the emotion. "We came because you are our son and we love you. We came because in 30 years, not a single day has passed that we didn't think of you. We came because when you're lost, you come home," Marina added. Edward looked at them and saw something he didn't expect: dignity. Even in hardship, even needing help, they weren't humbling themselves. They weren't asking. They were offering love. "I'll transfer a sum to you," Edward said, picking up his checkbook. "Enough to pay off your debts and live comfortably for the rest of your lives." "We don't want your money," Robert said. "We want our son," Marina added. Edward stopped with the pen in midair. Those words echoed in the silent office like a shout. "You don't understand," Edward said. "I'm not your son anymore. I've become someone else. I do things you wouldn't approve of. I make decisions that hurt people. I built this empire by stepping on anyone who got in my way. And you think that changes anything for us?" Marina asked. "It changes everything," Edward exploded. "You raised me to be a good, honest, upright person. And I became this," he gestured to the office, "a cold capitalist who only thinks about profit. Robert walked to the window and looked down at the city below. "Do you know what the happiest day of my life was?" he asked. Edward didn't answer. "It was the day of your graduation. Not because you had gotten a degree, but because you had managed to dream. Because you had dared to imagine a life different from ours." Robert turned to his son. "And do you know what the saddest day was? It wasn't the day of our fight. It was the day I realized you had forgotten to dream of happiness." Marina approached Edward and took his hands. "Son, it doesn't matter what you've become. What matters is what you can still be." Edward looked at his mother's hands, small, calloused from work, but still capable of conveying so much affection. Then he looked at his own hands, manicured with the expensive gold ring, but empty of true purpose. "I don't know how to go back to being who I was," he admitted. "You don't have to go back," Robert said. "You have to move forward, but this time taking us with you." It was at that moment that the secretary knocked on the door. "Mr. Smith, sorry to interrupt, but there's an urgent call from the construction site on the south side. There's been an accident." Edward closed his eyes. The reality of work always managed to find him, even in the most important moments. "What kind of accident?" he asked. "A worker fell from the scaffolding. He's hospitalized in serious condition." Edward felt his stomach churn. Once again, someone had been hurt because of one of his projects. Once again, he would have to deal with the consequences of his business. "I have to go," he said to his parents. "We're coming with you," Marina said. "No, you don't understand. It's work. It's corporate responsibility. It's about a person who got hurt," Robert interrupted. "This is about people, Edward. And people are family business." Edward looked at his father and saw determination in his eyes. Robert and Marina had no formal education, but they had something he had lost along the way: humanity. "All right," Edward said. "You can come." And so, for the first time in 30 years, Edward Smith left his office accompanied by his parents, heading to face a crisis that would test not only his business acumen, but also his capacity to be human. At the hospital, they would discover that the injured worker was only 22 years old, the same age Edward was when he broke away from his family, and that he had parents who loved him unconditionally. Just as Robert and Marina loved Edward, life sometimes creates cruel mirrors to show us who we really are. St. Luke's Hospital was in an uproar when Edward arrived with Robert and Marina. The emergency entrance was buzzing with activity, ambulances arriving, worried families, doctors rushing through the corridors. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the tension in the air created a heavy atmosphere that made Edward feel uncomfortable. He was used to solving problems from a distance, with phone calls and meetings. Being here, in the midst of the human chaos caused by an accident on one of his construction sites, was unknown territory. At the reception, a nurse with tired eyes attended to them. "Are you family of Mark Andrews?" she asked. "No," Edward replied. "I'm in charge of the company where he works." The woman looked him up and down, noticing the expensive suit, the gold watch, the posture of someone used to giving orders. "Waiting room 3, she said, pointing down a hallway. "The family is already there." Edward walked through the corridors, followed by his parents. With each step, he felt the weight of responsibility grow in his chest. It wasn't the first time an employee had been in an accident on his sites, but it was the first time he had come to the hospital in person. Before, he always handled everything through lawyers and settlements. The waiting room was small and cramped. About 10 people were there, men in simple, work-stained clothes, women with eyes red from crying, children running between the chairs without understanding the gravity of the situation. When Edward entered, a heavy silence fell over the group. A man stood up. He was large, strong, with the calloused hands of a construction worker. Edward recognized his face. It was John, the site foreman. "Mr. Smith," John said, his voice tense. "I didn't expect to see you here." "How's Mark?" Edward asked. "He's in surgery. Broke 3 ribs, his left arm, and hit his head. The doctors say the next few hours are critical." Edward felt his stomach tighten. The young man was only 22. He was practically a kid. How did it happen? John hesitated. Edward saw the man exchange glances with the other workers present. There was something they weren't saying. It was an accident, sir. These things happen. But Robert, who had worked for 40 years, knew that look. It was the look of someone afraid to tell the boss the truth. Son, Robert touched Edward's arm. I'm going to get some coffee. Are you coming with me? Edward got the message. He left the room with his parents, and when they were far enough away, Robert spoke. They're afraid to tell you the truth. What truth? The truth about what really caused the accident. Edward returned to the waiting room alone. This time, he approached John differently. John, I didn't come here as a boss. I came as someone who cares. Tell me what really happened. John looked around, saw that the other workers were encouraging him with their eyes. Mr. Smith, we've been asking for months to replace the safety equipment. The ropes are old, the helmets are cracked, the scaffolding makes noise when we climb it. Edward felt a pit in his stomach. And what was the response? That everything was within its legal expiration date. That replacing it now would be a waste of money. Edward closed his eyes. He vaguely remembered a meeting where the director of operations had requested authorization to renew the equipment. Edward had denied it, saying they could wait a few more months. Was Mark using an old rope? Yes, sir. The rope snapped when he was on the 10th floor. The silence that followed was deafening. Edward looked around the room and saw the faces of the people who knew the truth. The accident could have been prevented. If he had authorized the purchase of new equipment, Mark would be at home with his family right now. That's when a young woman ran into the waiting room. She was about 20, with long hair and desperate eyes. In her arms, she carried a small child who wouldn't stop crying. How is he? She asked out of breath. No one told me anything. I came running from work. John stood up and hugged the young woman. Camilla, he's in surgery. We don't know anything yet. Edward realized this must be Mark's girlfriend. He watched the scene. The young woman trying to calm the child, the workers forming a circle to support her, the simple solidarity of people who cared for one another. This is Camilla, John said to Edward, Mark's girlfriend. And this is Michael, their son. Edward looked at the child, a boy of about 2 with large, frightened eyes. The same look he probably had as a child when he was scared. Hi, Michael, Edward said, crouching down to the child's level. The boy looked at him with curiosity, then hid his face in his mother's shoulder. He's scared, Camilla explained. He doesn't understand why Daddy didn't come home. At that moment, Edward saw the situation from a completely different perspective. It wasn't just an injured employee. It was a father who might not come home. It was a family that could be torn apart because of an administrative decision he had made, thinking only of numbers. Marina approached Camilla. Can I help with the baby? She offered. Camilla hesitated, but saw in the older woman's eyes the same kindness her own grandmother used to have. He's hungry, she said. But I didn't bring anything. Let's go to the cafeteria, Marina suggested. I'll buy him something. While Marina took care of Camilla and the baby, Robert sat down with the workers and started talking. Edward watched his father. Even without knowing these men, Robert could connect with them. They spoke the same language, had the same concerns, shared the same struggles. Edward realized he had forgotten how to connect with real people. He spent his days in meetings with executives, negotiating with politicians, closing deals with businessmen. He had lost the ability to see the human being behind the employee. A doctor appeared in the waiting room. He was a young man with a tired expression. Family of Mark Andrews. Everyone stood up at the same time. The surgery was a success, the doctor said, and a collective sigh of relief echoed through the room. He's going to be fine, but the recovery will be long. At least 3 months without work. Camilla began to cry, but now they were tears of happiness. The workers hugged each other, celebrating the good news. Edward approached the doctor. Doctor, I'd like to know all the details about his treatment, physical therapy, medications. I want to ensure he has the best possible follow-up care. Are you family? The doctor asked. Edward hesitated. Technically he wasn't, but at that moment he felt like he was. I'm responsible for him. After the doctor left, Edward addressed the group. I'd like to speak with all of you. I know Mark's accident could have been prevented. I know you asked for new equipment, and I denied it. That is going to change. The workers listened to him in silence. From now on, all sites will have the best safety equipment available. I'm creating a special fund for it, and any request related to worker safety will have absolute priority. John frowned. With all due respect, Mr. Smith, we've heard promises like that before. Edward understood the distrust. Words were easy, actions were what mattered. Tomorrow, I will visit all the sites, personally, and I will fire any supervisor who is neglecting employee safety. Robert approached his son and placed a hand on his shoulder. I'm proud of you, he whispered. Edward looked at his father and saw something he hadn't seen in a long time, genuine approval. It wasn't pride in his financial success or social status. It was pride that he was doing the right thing. When they finally left the hospital, it was already night. Edward offered his parents a ride, which they silently accepted. During the drive to their house, Robert broke the silence. Son, can I ask you a question? Of course. When was the last time you felt good about yourself? Edward drove in silence for a few minutes, thinking about the answer. Today, he said finally. Today at the hospital. When I saw that Mark was going to be okay, and that I could do something to help. Marina smiled from the back seat. Then maybe it's time to do that more often. When they arrived at his parents' house, Edward parked the car but made no move to leave. Can I come in? He asked. I'd like to see the house where I grew up. Robert and Marina looked at each other, surprised but happy. Of course, son. This has always been your home. And for the first time in 30 years, Edward Smith walked through the door of the house where he was born, ready to find out if it was still possible to come home after so much lost time. The house seemed smaller than Edward remembered. The faded walls, the time-worn cement floor, the low ceiling that made everything feel cramped. But there was something in the atmosphere of the place that money couldn't buy. There was love embedded in every corner. Robert turned on the living room light. The furniture was simple. A floral print sofa, a coffee table with a cracked glass top, a bookshelf with old books and framed photographs. Edward approached the bookshelf and felt his heart ache. There were all the stages of his life. A baby in his mother's arms, a child with a toothless grin, a teenager in a school uniform, a young man in a cap and gown at graduation. His photos took up almost the entire bookshelf, as if he had never left. You kept everything, Edward murmured, picking up a photo of himself at 10 years old. A father and mother never give up on their son, Marina said, taking off the apron she wore over her clothes. No matter how far he strays, Edward continued to look at the photographs. There was one that made him pause, himself at 15, hugging Robert and Marina in front of the house. Everyone was smiling genuinely, spontaneously. He remembered that day. They had just renovated the front of the house, and Marina had insisted they take a photo of the happy family in their new home. I broke this, didn't I? Edward said, showing the photo. I broke this happiness. Robert sat on the sofa and motioned for Edward to join him. Son, happiness isn't something that breaks forever. It's like a plant that can wilt, but if you start caring for it again, it sprouts anew. Edward sat next to his father, feeling the softness of the old sofa where he had spent so many afternoons watching television. Dad, I need to tell you some things. Things I've done over the years. You might not like what you're about to hear. Marina settled into the armchair opposite them, her hands folded in her lap. We are your parents, Edward. There is nothing you could have done that would change that. Edward took a deep breath and began to talk. He spoke of the questionable deals, of the times he had evicted families to build luxury developments, of the employees fired without just cause, of the bids won with bribes, of the politicians he had bought, of all the decisions he had made putting profit above humanity. Robert and Marina listened in silence, without judgment, only with the attention that parents give their children when they need to unburden themselves. When Edward finished, the silence stretched for a few minutes. Outside, you could hear the sound of the neighbor's television, a child crying in the distance, the simple life of the neighborhood following its natural course. "Son," Robert finally said, "did you think we didn't know?" Edward looked up surprised. "You knew?" Marina smiled sadly. "Edward, your name is in the newspapers, on television. We always followed your life, even from a distance. We knew the kind of business you were in, and you still love you?" Robert completed. "Son, a parent's love doesn't come with conditions. We love you for who you are, not for what you do." Edward felt his eyes well up. "But I turned into a horrible person." "No," Marina said, getting up and sitting on the other side of Edward on the sofa. "You turned into a lost person." "It's different." Marina took her son's hand. "Do you know what our biggest mistake as parents was? It was not teaching you that success without humanity is failure." "You did teach me that," Edward protested. "I was the one who chose to ignore it." "Perhaps," Robert said. "But we also made a mistake by not coming after you when you pulled away. We let our pride speak louder than our love." Edward looked at his parents and saw something he didn't expect. They carried guilt too. "You had no obligation to run after me. I was the one who broke the family." "A family doesn't break, Edward," Marina said. "It can stretch, it can get hurt, it can even seem like it's ruptured. But as long as there is love, it can always be mended." Edward got up and walked to the window. Outside, he saw the small yard where he had played as a child. The oak tree that Robert had planted when he was born was still there, now gigantic, its branches shading the entire area. "I don't know how to fix what I've ruined," he admitted. "It's 30 years of wrong decisions, of hurt people, of lost opportunities." "You don't fix the past," Robert said, approaching him. "You build a different future." "How?" Robert pointed to the oak tree outside. "When I planted that tree, it was just a fragile sapling. It could have died in the first strong wind. But I cared for it day after day, year after year. Look at it now." Edward understood the metaphor. "Are you saying I can still change?" "I'm saying you've already started," Marina replied. "What you did today at the hospital, the promises you made to the workers. That's planting new saplings." Edward returned to the sofa and sat between his parents. "I want to try. I want to be a better person. But I need your help." "We've always been here," Robert said, "and we always will be. Even if I fail, even if I have relapses." "Son," Marina said, "true parents don't give up on their children in difficult times. It's exactly when you need us most that we stay closest." Edward hugged them both, feeling for the first time in decades what it was like to be truly home. Not in an expensive mansion, but in a place where he was loved unconditionally. "I want you to move into my house," he said. "Not as guests, but as family. I want to take care of you like you took care of me." Robert and Marina looked at each other. "Edward, we don't need luxury." "It's not about luxury," Edward interrupted. "It's about family. It's about correcting the mistake of leaving you behind when I made it in life." "And what if your rich friends don't approve of your poor parents?" Robert asked, half joking, half serious. Edward laughed. It was the first time he had truly laughed in a long time. "Dad, if they don't approve of you, it's because they're not my friends. They're just business contacts." Marina held her son's face with both hands. "Are you sure about this, my son? We don't want to get in the way of your life. You won't get in the way. You will complete it." It was at that moment that the phone rang. Robert answered in his simple way. "Hello?" On the other end of the line, a nervous voice. "Please, I need to speak with Mr. Edward Smith. It's urgent." Robert looked at his son. "It's for you." "They say it's urgent." Edward took the phone. "Edward Smith." "Mr. Smith, this is Dr. Henry from the hospital. Mr. Mark Andrews has had a complication. We need to operate again, but he's asking to speak with you before the surgery." Edward felt his stomach tighten. "I'm on my way." When he hung up the phone, Robert and Marina were already getting their keys. "We're coming with you," Robert said. "You don't have to—" "Yes, we do," Marina interrupted. "We're a family again now, and family faces things together." Edward smiled and hugged his parents again. For the first time in 30 years, he wasn't alone in a crisis. He had Robert and Marina by his side, and that made all the difference. On the way to the hospital, as he drove through the illuminated city streets, Edward realized he was facing the first test of his transformation. A young worker needed him, trusted him, and he couldn't let him down. Not this time. "Dad," Edward said as he drove, "do you think there's still time for me to become the man you wanted me to be?" Robert looked at his son in the rearview mirror. "Son, you already are. You just forgot." And at that moment, for the first time in decades, Edward Smith felt he was on the right path home. Not just to a physical house, but to the home of the heart, where love is more important than any material wealth. What they would find at the hospital would test this new family bond in a way none of them could imagine. The hospital was quieter this second time. The corridors echoed only with the hurried footsteps of Edward, Robert, and Marina as they made their way to the ICU. Dr. Henry was waiting for them at the door, with a grave expression that made Edward's heart race. "How is he?" Edward asked, unable to hide the anxiety in his voice. "Stable, but there was a complication from the previous surgery. We found some internal bleeding that we hadn't detected. We'll have to operate again, but—" The doctor hesitated. "But what, doctor?" "But he's refusing the surgery until he speaks with you. He says he has something important to tell you." Edward felt his legs weaken. The young man was risking his own life to talk to him. "Can I see him?" "Just for a few minutes." "And he's very weak." Edward turned to his parents. "Can you wait here?" "We want to come with you," Marina said. "Mom, the ICU only allows—" "Edward," Robert interrupted, "if this boy wants to talk to you, maybe it's because he needs to see that you're not just a rich boss. Maybe he needs to see that you're a son, that you have a family, that you have a heart." The doctor, who had been listening to the conversation, nodded. "I can make an exception. 2 minutes for everyone." The ICU was a place that smelled of life and death at the same time. Mark was in bed 3, surrounded by machines that monitored every beat of his heart. When he saw Edward enter accompanied by Robert and Marina, his eyes lit up slightly. "Mr. Smith," Mark said, his voice weak but determined. "You came." Edward approached the bed, his chest tightening as he saw the young man looking so fragile. "Of course I came, Mark. How are you feeling?" "Sore," Mark tried to smile. "But that's not why I asked to see you." "What is it?" Mark looked at Robert and Marina, then turned his eyes back to Edward. "I wanted to thank you." Edward frowned. "Thank me? For what?" "For coming to the hospital yesterday. For promising to improve safety. No boss has ever done that before." Edward felt a pang of guilt. "Mark, the accident shouldn't have happened. If I had authorized the new equipment—" "Mr. Smith," Mark interrupted him, "you could have sent your lawyers. You could have handled everything from a distance. But you came in person. You met my family. That means you care." Robert approached the bed. "He always cared, son. He was just